So let's look at the other principle then. What is a prescriptive reading or descriptive reading, especially when we deal with the letters? Okay, so this is not a method to look at what the text says. This is reflective. This is about exploring how we tend to read. This will tell you more about you than it tells you about the text, but it's important for us to pick up on, okay? Because we either read prescriptively or we read descriptively. So if you're going to Google this and people tell you that you can tell from the text if something is prescriptive or descriptive, you're talking about something else. This has to do with how you respond to the text. So let me give you a definition. So if you read prescriptively, you are interpreting. You are gathering meaning from the text by reading prescriptively. So the text is read and understood as being instruction. So you decide to read it in this way. It is so you decide to read it as a way like you need to implement it, like do what it says in the same way at all times and all places. It's like prescription medicine. You take something 3 times a day with some food because it says that. That's how you read the Bible. But if you adhere to a descriptive interpretation, then your approach to reading a text is you see it as a narrative. You see it as an account of what happens in a certain place at a certain time for a certain reason. This is how you decide to read the text. You decide that it describes what happens. So in that case, it either fits the overall purpose of the greater story, the biblical narrative, and so you get meaning from that, or there's some sort of principle for living in that you can kind of migrate from there. Okay? So what it is not this. Reading prescriptively or descriptively has nothing to do with whether the text appears prescriptive or descriptive. When it says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, or if your hand causes you to sin, chop it off, that would appear prescriptive, like something that you do. Well, most people would say, I'm not going to pull out my eye and cut off my hand because I'm sinning. This is just something that it described at the time what the people believe. Okay, so it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with how you decide how you read the text. Here's another caveat. You read one way or the other. You don't do it both. You can't have it both ways. You cannot be a little bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. It's impossible to read one passage both ways simultaneously. And I mean no insensitivity for those who are trying to get pregnant or whatever, but it's a black and white sort of choice. So how do people go about picking and choosing, right? Well, that's precisely the point. To know ourselves. And this is true with every kind of literature that we read, right? The point here is we bring ourselves to the text. We've been influenced. And what we think the text is supposed to say is often what we bring to the text, and then we read it that way. It's an awareness of what we think. So what does it look like to do a descriptive and prescriptive reading of this text? This is at the end of a letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 16. This is a long goodbye by the writer. The writer is Paul. He writes to Christians in Rome, and he says, here's what you should do. Greet one another with a holy kiss. all the churches of Christ greet you. So if I choose to read this prescriptively, I would choose to read this in a way that this is like a command. This prescribes how to read and prescribes, how to live. So let's look at that. In that way, it would tell me how to live, but not only that, how to live back then and how to live now. So this was written to Rome. And then I would decide then how for me to live today, where I live. So, but you cannot then start to read it figuratively. So if it says to greet one another with a holy kiss, I am to greet other believers with a holy kiss. Not a hug, not a halfway kiss, but a holy kiss. So I would have to figure out what a holy kiss was in Rome and emulate that, do it exactly the same way. And then making sure that whenever I meet people far away, that I bring greetings from other churches, because that's what it says to do. The moment that I start interpreting a holy kiss, it's like, well, but where we live here, we don't really give a holy kiss. We give a holy hug, or we give a high five, or we just kind of nod. That very moment you have turned descriptive. You cannot do both. So what would a descriptive reading look like? Well, that's often a little harder, okay? Because then you look at the bigger story and the bigger principle here. So apparently, Paul is writing to people to greet one another in a culturally appropriate way. So you could say, okay, so then when Christians meet Christians, we should greet one another. We should be excited to meet one another and greet one another, but in a way that's culturally appropriate. And that differs from place to place, right? Or in general, it could have something to do with our attitude toward others, to be encouraging and receptive. Let's do another one. This is in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5. It says, be subject or submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So out of deep respect for Christ, we submit to one another, we bow down to one another, that kind of thing. Okay, so think with me here. A prescriptive reading. This is in a passage where it talks about the church, people in general. It talks about singing together and doing stuff together. And then after this, it goes over into husbands and wives, and then sadly enough, slaves and masters, and then children and parents. So be subject to one another is believers, Jesus followers in the church. If I do it prescriptively, it prescribes that that's what we do. You know, believers, when believers have different opinions or something, we say, you know, I'm not always in agreement with you, but I take your point. And the other person says, yeah, I take your point too. And really, it's a strong sort of language there, like, okay, and I do that because I respect you because of Jesus. A descriptive reading here would be what? Like you're generally mutually kind to one another, that we respect partnership sort of approaches, we respect teamwork. Okay, that's verse 21. Now we go on to the next verse. Whoa, wives, be subject to your husbands as you all are to the Lord. It leans on the previous verse. In fact, that verb is actually not in that verse. It actually says, wives, to your husbands as you are to the Lord, because it gets from the previous verse this idea of submission. Okay, if you read this prescriptively, you'll have to figure out in the context what it meant. And in the context, that really meant that husbands had authority over their wives. They could beat them, no problem. You know, they could tell them to stay put, no problem. So if you bring that into today's context, it would look like that. Some people go like, well, but you know, there's all sorts of caveats now. In that context, that's what it is. And so then you do that today too. So then wives are underneath husbands, and husbands rule over wives today. What if you take it descriptively? Okay, descriptively would say, well, it's written to a community of Jesus believers in Ephesus. This is in Turkey. It's a long time ago. During that time, people were very patriarchal. It was actually a code by Aristotle. That's the way it was done in the culture. And apologize, that's your call. And at that time, that's just the way it was. Now, you don't find it in every letter. In some letters, it's more nuanced. Actually, we have letters where husbands and wives work together. We actually have examples where women lead the churches. So it seems to be that this is very specific for this community in Ephesus. So a descriptive reading would say, wow, this is actually a solution to some issue going on in Ephesus. So a descriptive reading would say, This is written by a person to Ephesus in a very pastoral sort of way, saying, there's some stuff going on there. And it's best if we kind of blend in with culture here. And this is what the culture does. Not always ideal, but this is what the culture does. So why don't we do some of that? And then a little bit later on, it will be through the prescriptive as well. It talks a little bit about, what that looks like. Don't be harsh. Don't be unkind. So what it would look like today is that if there are troubles between people in the church, then you look and make sure that you're not completely weird from the culture and that you find kind solutions. And this is really an encouragement for leaders to be resourceful and kind and to work with relationships in light of culture. So our culture is really not shifting towards patriarchy. Our culture is shifting the other way, where women are equal partners. And that would be the descriptive reading. Ooh, when we keep going, it gets uncomfortable, doesn't it? Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling and singleness of heart as you obey Christ. This is only just a little section further away from the part that we just looked at. See that? So this is just a little further, the start of the next chapter. It's still the same train of thought. You subject to one another, wives to husbands, and then it keeps going, slaves to earthly masters. So if you want to do this prescriptively, you really need to have slaves. And you really need to have slaves obey their masters. And not just in any way, with fear and trembling. They really need to bow down to these masters. This is the part where people sometimes say, well, not every master was bad. Well, then why do you need to fear and tremble? So a prescriptive reading would mean that you take it very straightforward. So if in that setting you had slaves, then in this setting we have slaves. If in that setting you had earthly masters, then in this setting it's okay to have earthly masters. If in that setting they were to fear and tremble, then in this setting you fear and tremble. And not just for any reason, but because it's out of obedience to Christ. Whoa, this is so hard, right? Here's another thing. If you chose to read the wives submit to your husbands just a few verses before, why would you switch here and suddenly do a descriptive reading? What makes you decide to just flip-flop between that? Like this one I do prescriptive, this one I do descriptive. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, it's because we no longer do this, the question would become, why don't we no longer do this? Because it's abhorrent. Because it's completely contradicting everything that Jesus stood for. So why is wives submitting to their husbands also not contradicting what Jesus stood for? You see where we're going with this? So what do we do with this? Here's what you cannot do. You cannot say, I'm taking this prescriptively, but slaves, I've heard this in churches, but slaves, that's more like employees. And masters are employers. This is more like Christians should be nice in the working world. Well, first of all, it doesn't flow, besides the fact that you can do it, because I have a boss and he's very nice here at UMHB, but I don't serve him. I don't obey him with fear and trembling. That's HR would have a cow. That's not the way we conduct our ministry here. And that's not the way that we teach here at UMHB. We are respectful. We don't fear and tremble. That's just not the way we do things in our culture. And that's not the way we ought to do things in our churches either. We don't fear and tremble for our Christian leaders. That's just not okay. The second reason that this, of course, is not okay is because you cannot mix descriptive and prescriptive readings. You either take it all the way or you go descriptive. I think the descriptive reading, the only thing that I can do with this is so abhorrent, is that there are times that you blend with culture for the sake of making a much bigger impact and doing away with this evil altogether. Maybe they were plotting all along to do away with this evil institution, or maybe the writing is wrong, okay? But you can't have it both. So very interesting, right? Last one, I think it's the last one. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. This is in 1 Corinthians. So you can do this, right? Prescriptive, what would it look like? You literally flee from the worship of idols, like idol gods, like little idol gods that I've lived in areas where people have that. Here in the United States, we have people that have idols, have a special place in their house where they have idols represented, and they worship that. And so the word here is, don't do that. Apparently they did it in Corinth. And if you read it prescriptively, the word is, if you do that here, you should not do it. In fact, you should run from it. What this is not, this is the descriptive reading is not, you should not worship idols and then replace idols for your car, your phone. You cannot just replace one thing. A descriptive reading would have to do with, what did these idols represent? The idols did not represent just one object of worship, right? Idols represented a much broader thing in culture, but it was religiously based. It was religion. It was something that purely took the place of God religiously. So you can really not make an application there of it being something materialistic. So this is really rough, right? But the main point here is that you choose. And the one thing that you don't want to do is pick and choose and pick and choose. You go from one verse and the two verses later, you go like, this one, I think I take it quote unquote literally, this one figuratively, this one literally. And if you find yourself doing that, I want you to wonder. I want you to ask yourself, why am I doing that? And that's, if nothing else, a very good question. Maybe just be consistent. All right.